Kyoto, Japan, 1604, was a place where the air itself seemed heavy with the weight of tradition and the sharp scent of pine and steel. Yet for a young samurai named Teeshi, the atmosphere felt like a suffocating blanket that pressed down upon his very soul. He collapsed onto the wooden floor of the dojo, his chest heaving not merely from the physical exertion of 10,000 sword swings, but from a deeper, invisible drainage that seemed to seep from his marrow. His master, Yamamoto-sensei, stood over him, his silhouette framed by the late afternoon sun that spilled through the rice paper doors, his voice a calm river against the jagged rocks of Teeshi's panic. Yamamoto observed that the boy was tired not because his muscles were weak, for Teeshi possessed the strength of a bull and the agility of a deer, but because his spirit was dangerously heavy, burdened by invisible weights that no amount of sleep could remedy. Teeshi lay there, sweat stinging his eyes, utterly confused because he had done everything right. He had trained harder than any other student, slept less, pushed more, and sacrificed every comfort. Yet he felt hollowed out, drained, and completely burned out. In stark contrast to Teeshi's struggle stood the legend of Miyamoto Musashi, the demon swordsman who wandered Japan fighting duel after duel, creating exquisite art, writing profound philosophy, meditating for days on end, and engaging in over 60 life-or-death combats without ever losing or showing a flicker of the exhaustion that now paralyzed Teeshi. The secret, Yamamoto whispered, was something that modern people and struggling warriors alike had forgotten. Energy does not come from effort, but from alignment, and exhaustion is not the result of the work you do, but rather the reason why you do it, raising the question of whether one is walking a straight path or running in desperate, energy-leaking circles. The awakening began in the quiet solitude of a garden behind the dojo, where the shadows stretched long and thin like the fingers of ghosts, and where Master Yamamoto forced Teeshi to confront the source of his fatigue. The master asked a simple question that struck with the force of a thunderclap. Why did Teeshi come to the dojo? The young man's answers were automatic and rehearsed: to bring honor to his family, to prove his worth, to be recognized as a master. But Yamamoto stopped him with a gentle, firm hand, revealing that these very motivations were the architects of his exhaustion. He explained that Teeshi was not training to master himself, but was instead performing for an invisible audience, seeking approval from a father who wasn't there and validation from peers who were too busy with their own struggles to care. Yamamoto picked up a small, jagged stone and placed it in Teeshi's trembling palm, explaining that every act performed for approval, every comparison to another, and every hesitation born of overthinking was a stone added to an invisible sack carried on the back. He mimed placing stone after stone into Teeshi's hands until the psychological weight became a tangible pressure, illustrating that Teeshi was not tired from the sword, but from carrying a mountain of stones that served no purpose in combat or life. Musashi, the master explained, fought over 60 duels and lived to old age with boundless vitality because he fought solely to understand himself, carrying no stones of validation or performance, and thus his energy flowed from walking a straight path rather than leaking away in the circular pursuit of other people's opinions. The following morning marked the beginning of Teeshi's true education, commencing with a lesson in the principle of Dakoto, or the way of walking alone, which required a ruthless purging of the unnecessary. Yamamoto led him to a dusty storage room filled with mountains of equipment and instructed him to pack for a year in the mountains, watching as Teeshi anxiously gathered a massive pile of spare clothes, weapons, books, and comfort items, driven by the fear of what if. With a cutting stare, Yamamoto quoted Musashi, telling him to do nothing which is of no use, for every possession is a weight, and every attachment is a chain that binds the spirit. Under the master's gaze, Teeshi was forced to discard item after item, stripping away the safety nets and the comforts until he was left with only a single sword, one set of clothes, a blanket, and a bowl, realizing with a shock that half of his pile was fear manifest in physical form. They moved to a grove where Yamamoto drew a picture in the dirt of two men, one hunched under a boulder representing mental baggage like insults, worries, and obligations, and the other walking tall and free. He explained that Musashi lived like a ghost, often sleeping on floors and traveling barefoot, not out of poverty, but because he understood that energy comes from carrying less, and he ruthlessly asked of every thought and commitment, "Is this useful to my path?" before discarding anything that answered no, teaching Teeshi that true power lies in the terrifying freedom of simplicity. The training then shifted to the internal landscape, where for one agonizing week, Teeshi was tasked not with changing his behavior, but simply noticing every time he acted out of a desire for validation, comparison, or approval. The results were horrifying to the young samurai, who realized by the third day that his entire existence was contaminated. Every sword swing was shadowed by the thought of looking good for Kenji. Every meditation session was plagued by wondering if the master noticed his stillness, and every meal was rushed to appear efficient. Yamamoto explained that this constant fracturing of the mind, the split between the one doing the action and the one watching the performance, was the leak draining his spirit, a massive cognitive load that consumed more energy than the physical act itself. He recounted how Musashi, even at the tender age of 13 after winning his first duel, did not celebrate or seek glory, but went home alone to reflect, fighting to test his own integrity rather than to impress the crowd. This clarity allowed Musashi to retain his energy, while Teeshi was hemorrhaging vitality by fighting a war on two fronts, one against the task at hand, and a much more exhausting one against his own need to be seen and admired by others. Week 2 and 3 pushed Teeshi into the realm of single-pointed action and the destruction of the comparison trap, moving from intellectual understanding to visceral practice. He was commanded to engage in Hashin Pinchan, or ordinary mind, where he was to only eat when eating, only train when training, and only rest when resting, without the parasitic thoughts of what came next or how well he was doing. When he failed, his mind wandering to the quality of his stance, Yamamoto stopped him, demonstrating a sword strike that was terrifying in its lack of tension and wasted movement, a strike that simply was. To cure the debilitating disease of comparison, Yamamoto blindfolded Teeshi during sparring, forcing him to fight without knowing if his opponent was the skilled Hiroshi or a novice, stripping away the layers of inferiority and superiority that usually dictated his energy levels. Deprived of the ability to judge himself against others visually, Teeshi found his energy stabilizing, his movements becoming fluid and responsive to the immediate reality of the air currents and sound rather than the rigid expectations of his ego, giving him his first taste of the flow state, where time disappears and energy feels infinite. As the months turned, Yamamoto gathered the students to explain the warrior psychology and the neuroscience of energy that underpinned Musashi's supernatural endurance, bridging the gap between ancient mysticism and the mechanics of the human mind. He spoke of cognitive load, explaining that when the mind is split between a task and the judgment of that task, it burns glucose and spirit at a ruinous rate, whereas alignment conserves resources. He drew parallels to the Stoics like Marcus Aurelius, who taught that power comes from controlling one's own perception rather than external events, and explained that seeking validation is a form of attachment that anchors one's peace to the volatile winds of others' opinions. Musashi's genius lay in his practice of non-attachment and the cultivation of mushin, or no mind, a state where the gap between thought and action vanishes. By making his discipline a rhythm, like brushing one's teeth, rather than a matter of motivation, Musashi bypassed the energy-expensive process of willpower, allowing him to accumulate boundless vitality while his opponents exhausted themselves trying to try. The first true transformation manifested in a sparring match against the dojo's best student, Hiroshi, a test that would usually have left Teeshi sleepless with anxiety and dread. Instead, armed with the new internal technology of the stone removal, Teeshi approached the match with a terrifying calmness, treating it not as a performance to be won, but as a moment to be inhabited. When the fight began, Hiroshi attacked with his signature aggressive speed, but Teeshi did not fight back in the traditional sense. He simply responded to the moment without the friction of thought or the fear of losing. As the minutes ticked by, a reversal of nature occurred. The superior fighter, Hiroshi, began to gasp and falter, his energy drained by the desperate need to win and the frustration of his attacks hitting nothing but air, while Teeshi remained fresh, his breath even, his mind a still pond reflecting the moon. When Hiroshi finally collapsed, defeated by his own exertion, Teeshi realized that winning requires massive energy, but pure presence creates it, proving that Musashi never burned out because he never fought the phantom war of ego, only the physical reality in front of him. To cement this understanding, Teeshi was sent to a mountain monastery for a deep training arc, enduring 3 months of crushing boredom and repetitive labor under the watchful eye of Master Hakuin. The schedule was a brutal loop of waking at 3 a.m., freezing water purification, hours of meditation, and manual labor, designed to break the addiction to novelty and stimulation that plagues the modern mind. At first, Teeshi resisted, his mind screaming during the long hours of carrying water, wishing he were doing something noble, like sword fighting, until Hakuin pointed out that this resistance was the leak. He learned that Musashi painted, carved, and wrote not as hobbies, but as extensions of his training, bringing the same total presence to a brush stroke as he did to a sword cut. One day, while carrying water, Teeshi stopped wishing he was elsewhere and simply carried the water, and in that instant, the exhaustion vanished, replaced by a clarity that felt like a bell ringing in a snowstorm. He understood finally that energy does not come from the world or the activity, but from one's relationship to it, and that alignment allows the warrior to tap into a source that does not depend on circumstances. The final confrontation took place upon his return, where he was tasked with facing a real threat, a rogue ronin named Nakamura who had been terrorizing the local villages and killing challengers. This was no practice. It was life or death, yet Teeshi felt a strange, cool distance from the fear that should have crippled him. In the village square, Nakamura mocked him and launched a series of vicious, killing strikes, but Teeshi did not engage with the man's anger or his reputation. He moved like smoke, his mind empty of the desire to survive or the fear of death, simply observing the geometry of the violence and fitting himself into the empty spaces. Nakamura, used to opponents who fought back with equal tension, quickly burned through his stamina, his rage making him sloppy and inefficient. Teeshi waited for the inevitable opening and ended the fight with a single, precise movement that disarmed the ronin without killing him, standing over his defeated foe not with pride, but with the quiet stillness of a mountain that has weathered a storm, proving that he had truly learned to walk alone. Decades later, an older Teeshi, now a master in his own right, stood in his dojo facing a young, exhausted student who asked the same desperate question he had once asked. "Why am I so tired?" Teeshi smiled, the lines of his face mapping a life of alignment, and placed a small stone in the boy's hand, beginning the cycle anew. He explained that the secret of Miyamoto Musashi was not in the strength of his arm, but in the emptiness of his mind, in the refusal to carry the stones of approval, comparison, and resistance. He handed the student a broom and told him to begin by removing what was of no use, teaching that the warrior's path to infinite energy is not found in resting more, but in stopping the leaks, in aligning action with purpose, and in walking a straight path through a world that runs in circles. He looked beyond the student, seemingly speaking to all warriors across time, inviting them to join the lineage of the Kyoto, to drop their invisible burdens, and to discover that when one carries nothing of no use, the spirit becomes as inexhaustible as the void itself.